June 22, 168 BTA, a flat coastal plain in northern Greece, below a town called Pydna. 21,000 Macedonian pikemen step off in a single body, 16 ranks deep, each man carrying a sarissa over 20 feet long, and the entire formation moves like one animal. The Roman commander watching them come, Lucius Aemilius Paullus, was a hard man near 60 who had spent his life around armies, and by the tradition that came down to us, he admitted afterward that he had never seen anything more terrifying. The pike wall struck the Roman line, and the Roman line went backward. Legionaries pushed their swords at a hedge of iron points and could not reach a single human being. Some Romans reportedly grabbed the sarissas with their bare hands. It did not matter. The wall came on. By nightfall, the ancient accounts tell us something close to 20,000 Macedonians were dead, the king was running for the coast, and the kingdom Alexander the Great had built was finished as a military power. One afternoon, roughly 1 hour of actual killing. And here is the detail that should not make sense. The Roman formation that did this was full of holes, deliberate holes, gaps in the fighting line wide enough to drive a wagon through, spaced at regular intervals across the entire front, in the face of the most concentrated frontal pressure weapon of the ancient world. Every instinct in infantry warfare says a gap in the line is where you die. The Romans built their line out of gaps, on purpose, for almost 2 centuries, and in that time the Triplex Acies broke the successor kingdoms of Alexander one after another. Most descriptions of this formation stop at the surface. 3 lines of infantry, young men in front, veterans in back, a checkerboard. That description is true, and it explains nothing, because the Triplex Acies was not really a wall of shields at all. It was a machine built out of human beings, with moving parts, pressure valves, and a design brief no other army of its era had figured out. The machine was not designed to stop the enemy, it was designed to process a fuel that every ancient battle burned and no ancient formation could manage. That fuel was exhaustion. Here is what this file contains. First, the gaps themselves, the intervals that should have doomed the line, and what actually happened, mechanically, when an enemy formation pushed into one, because the answer is stranger than a trap. Second, the exhaustion problem. What modern measurement of sustained muscle exertion tells us about how quickly a man in close combat stops being dangerous, and why the phalanx, the most feared formation in the Mediterranean, had no answer to it at all. Third, the passage of lines. The maneuver where thousands of men exchange places in the middle of a battle without opening the door to a massacre, which may be the single most difficult piece of drill in pre-modern warfare. Fourth, an afternoon in North Africa in 202 BCE, when one Roman commander disassembled this entire machine and rebuilt it into a different shape while Hannibal's army stood watching. And fifth, a 4-word Latin phrase that ordinary Romans used in everyday conversation for generations, a phrase about the third line, the triarii, the men who almost never fought, and once you hear it you will understand what this formation actually was. I will give you that phrase near the end because you need to see the machine run first. One note on method before we start. This channel takes formations apart the way an engineer takes apart an engine, working from the ancient sources and from the modern scholarship on how these systems actually functioned, and where the evidence is thin or contested, I will say so plainly. Start with the machine the Triplex Acies was built to kill, because you cannot understand a weapon without understanding its target. The phalanx was older than Rome mattered. In its Greek form, the one described in the scholarship on hoplite warfare, including Matthew Sears's 2019 study Understanding Greek Warfare, it was a dense block of spearmen, shields overlapping, each man's shield covering part of the man beside him, so that the formation's strength was literally collective. No individual in a phalanx fights alone, and no individual in a phalanx can leave. A 2023 study of unit cohesion in the Athenian hoplite phalanx makes the underlying logic explicit. The formation's power was its cohesion, the psychological and physical binding of the line into one object. As long as the line held together, it was close to unbeatable from the front. And that is precisely the vulnerability, because cohesion of that kind is a one-time asset. A phalanx fights as a single piece. It commits everything at once, every man engaged or pressing on the man in front of him, and when its cohesion cracks, there is no mechanism, none, for putting it back together while the enemy is still hitting you. The Macedonians took this design and made it heavier. The sarissa doubled and more the reach of the old hoplite spear, so that the first 5 ranks of a Macedonian phalanx could all present their points ahead of the front rank's shields. From the front, a wall of iron 5 layers deep. Paullus, the Greek historian who watched Rome swallow his world and spent his career trying to explain why, examined exactly this matchup, legion against phalanx, and his verdict has framed the debate ever since. The phalanx, he argued, is irresistible under one set of conditions: flat ground, secure flanks, a single decisive push. Change any condition and it begins to die. Now look at what the pike wall costs the men inside it. Close combat with shield and weapon is not like marching. It is sustained, near maximal muscular effort under load, and the human body fails at it fast. A 2008 study in the Tohoku Journal of Experimental Medicine measured how the subjective sensation of muscle fatigue climbs during sustained muscle force exertion, and the picture is consistent. Hold a hard contraction, and the feeling of failure rises steeply, well before the muscle actually gives out, degrading everything you do in the meantime. Biomechanical work on force tremor has shown that exertion and fatigue are written directly into the tremor patterns of the working muscle. The shake gets into the hands, which for a man holding a pike or a sword means his weapon is telling everyone around him exactly how empty he is. And this is not an ancient problem that modern soldiers evolved past. A 2016 study examined physical exertion in military personnel under heat stress, because armies still have to measure what heat, load, and effort do to a fighting man. As late as 1968, the United States Army was producing formal studies of the bayonet, knife, and hand-to-hand combat skills an infantry squad leader needed, because the close fight never stopped being its own brutal discipline. One historical study of bayonet and club musket fighting carries a subtitle that settles the tone of the whole subject: Fighting means killing. Killing at arm's length is the most expensive work a human body can do, and most modern reconstructions of ancient battle conclude that a man can only do it flat out for a span you would measure in minutes, not hours. Then he must rest, or he is done, standing in the line as cargo. So hold both facts at once. Battles lasted hours. Men lasted minutes. Every ancient army faced that arithmetic. The phalanx answered it with mass and depth. Ranks of fresh muscle physically pushing the spent men forward. One enormous expenditure that had to win before it emptied. The Romans answered it differently. They built a formation that could take exhausted men out of the fight and put fresh men in while the fight was happening. That is the entire secret of the Triplex Acies. Everything else, the gaps, the checkerboard, the 3 lines, the veterans kneeling at the rear, is engineering in service of that one function: the failing spent men. The legion recycled them. Now the geometry. The mid-Republican legion deployed its heavy infantry in 3 lines, the Triplex Acies. In front, the hastati, the youngest men. Behind them, the principes, men in their prime, and the sources are consistent that these first 2 lines formed in maniples of 120 men each. At the rear, the triarii, older veterans in smaller maniples, traditionally 60 men, and we will come back to them because they are the strangest part of the design. The maniples did not stand shoulder to shoulder. Each line left intervals between its maniples, roughly as wide as the maniples themselves, and each line stood offset from the line ahead, so that the maniples of the principes covered the gaps of the hastati, and the triarii covered the gaps of the principes. Seen from above, a checkerboard, the pattern the Romans knew from the quincunx, the 5 spots on a dice face. Here is the mechanical question that matters. An enemy mass pushes into one of those inviting gaps in the first line. In a solid wall, that penetration is catastrophe. The breach widens. The line is rolled up from inside. In the Triplex Acies, watch what the geometry does. The enemy party that surges into the interval has left its own formation to do it. It is now a tongue of men in a corridor, with a Roman maniple standing directly ahead of it, and Roman maniples on both flanks of it, and the men on the edges of that tongue are being cut at from 3 sides by soldiers whose entire weapon system, the big scutum shield and the short gladius, was built for exactly this close, individual, multi-directional fight. Paullus put his finger on the difference. The Roman soldier could fight in any direction, as an individual and as a unit, while the phalangite was only a soldier when facing front in formation. The gap does not transmit the enemy's momentum down the line. It swallows the momentum. The surge that should shatter the formation is absorbed, chewed at from the flanks, and spat back. The gaps are pressure valves. A solid wall passes force along its whole length, which is why walls fail all at once. A vented line bleeds force off at intervals, which is why the Triplex Acies failed nowhere. And the intervals had a second function, the one that made the exhaustion engine run. They were doors. When the hastati had burned their minutes, when the tremor was in their sword arms, the signal sounded, and the first line withdrew, not backward in a mob, but through the intervals of the principes behind them, whose fresh maniples then stood as the new front, either stepping forward into contact or receiving the enemy on their shields. The spent hastati reformed at the rear, drank, breathed, and became the reserve. The enemy, who had just spent everything wrecking themselves against one Roman line, now faced a second Roman line that had not yet fought at all. I want to be honest that the fine mechanics of this passage of lines are debated. The ancient writers describe the system's shape more clearly than its choreography, and historians still argue about exactly how the relief ran under contact. But the shape itself, 3 lines, intervals, staged relief, is about as well attested as anything in Republican warfare, and the drill discipline it demanded is staggering, because thousands of frightened men had to move through one another, in noise and blood, without ever leaving an open door at the wrong moment. That is what Roman training was for, not swordsmanship, doors. Go back to Pydna with that machine in your head, and the battle stops being a mystery. The phalanx's first push was magnificent because the first push was all a phalanx had, one total commitment of cohesion and muscle. The Romans gave ground, which cost the machine nothing, and the pike wall followed, off the flat and onto rough ground, where a formation 16 ranks deep and a mile wide cannot keep its dressing. Seams opened between its blocks, and Paullus sped his maniples into the seams. Small, self-commanded, 120-man parts, each one designed to fight surrounded, each one now inside the wall where a 20-foot pike is useless and a 2-foot gladius is the best weapon on earth. The phalanx had spent its cohesion and could not buy it back. The legion had spent its first line and had 2 more, 1 hour. 20,000 dead. The machine did to the wall what machines do to walls. But Pydna is the machine finished. To respect it, you have to see it invented, stressed, and reconfigured. So here are 3 more engagements, each showing a different part of the mechanism. First, the invention in the hills of Samnium in the 4th century BTE. The Romans did not start with maniples. By their own tradition, they started as a phalanx themselves, a Greek-style citizen spear wall, and the scholarship bears out how derivative the early system was. A 2010 study of the legion's earliest manipular constitution traces the long reorganization, and a 2015 paper examined the Greco-Macedonian influences that kept shaping the manipular system even as it diverged. What forced the divergence in the traditional account was terrain. Samnium is a country of ridges and broken valleys, and the Samnites were hill fighters who would not stand politely on a plain. A solid line in that country tears itself apart on the ground before the enemy touches it, every slope and gully opening involuntary gaps. And somewhere in those decades of ugly mountain war, the Romans made the conceptual leap that defines them. If the ground is going to break your line into pieces anyway, build the line out of pieces. Design the gaps in, and then design them covered. The maniple, the word itself means a handful, was terrain damage turned into doctrine. Second, the reconfiguration at Zama in 202 BTE, the last battle against Hannibal. The ancient sources count 80 war elephants in the Carthaginian line, and an elephant charge does to a checkerboard what it does to anything, unless the checkerboard moves. The BO took the standard Triplex Acies and reset it, aligning the maniples of all 3 lines one behind another, column behind column, turning the staggered intervals into straight open lanes running clear through the entire formation and screening those lanes with light troops. When the elephants came, the animals did what charging animals do. They followed the path of least resistance, and the path had been drawn for them. The elephants ran the lanes, harassed from both sides, and passed out the back of the army like water through a grate. Then, at the crisis of the infantry fight, Scipio halted, recalled and reformed his engaged line, and extended his principes and triarii outward onto the wings, converting 3 short lines into 1 long one to match Hannibal's front. Understand what that means mechanically. In the middle of the most important battle in Roman history, against the best general alive, a Roman army changed shape twice. The Triplex Acies was not a formation the way the phalanx was a formation. It was a kit of standard parts, and a commander who understood the parts could build the machine the day required. Third, The distributed command at Cynocephali in 197 BCE, Rome against Philip V of Macedon, a meeting engagement in fog along a ridge that neither side had chosen. Philip's right-wing phalanx formed first, caught the Romans on the slope, and drove them, the wall working exactly as designed. His left wing, still climbing in column through the mist, never formed at all, and the Roman right went through it. And then came the moment Polybius records, and notice what it says about the system. An unnamed tribune, not the consul, a mid-level officer whose name history never kept, saw the field, took 20 maniples out of the victorious Roman right on his own judgment, and brought them around into the rear of Philip's winning phalanx. A phalanx cannot turn. 16 ranks of leveled pikes point one way. The battle ended there. The point is not the maneuver, it is that the formation had a mid-level officer with the authority to make it and 20 subunits capable of executing it. The phalanx had one brain. The Triplex Acies had a brain in every maniple. The geometry of gaps was also a geometry of command. So put the whole machine on the bench and count its working principles, because there are 5, and they answer the 5 promises I opened with. Principle 1. The gap is a component, not a flaw. Every interval in the Roman line was covered by a maniple behind it and flanked by maniples beside it, so that penetration converted the attacker's best men into a surrounded tongue inside a kill box, and the enemy's momentum, the one asset a charging formation owns, was absorbed at the valves instead of transmitted down the wall. Principle 2. Burn muscle in shifts. And sustained maximal exertion finishes a man in minutes. The study of fatigue we walked through earlier is really the study of ancient battle. The legion metered its expenditure, fresh hastati for the opening, fresh principes for the middle, and relief scheduled before collapse rather than after, which is the entire difference between rotation and rout. Principle 3. The passage of lines. The intervals were doors, and the drill for moving a spent line back through a fresh one under contact, without ever presenting an open breach, was the legion's true weapon, an unglamorous choreography rehearsed until fear could not break it. Principle 4. Modularity. Because the maniple was a standard part, the army could be reformed into lanes at Zama, into a single extended front, into 20 maniples peeled off by a tribune at Cynocephali, and the enemy general was never fighting a shape, he was fighting a system that could become any shape. And Principle 5, the escalating reserve, which brings us finally to the third line. The triarii. Older men, veterans, the smallest maniples, and they carried the old thrusting spear long after the front lines had gone over to the sword. In most battles they did nothing. They knelt by the tradition behind their shields, spears angled forward, a low hedge of iron at the very back of the army, and they watched. And now the phrase I promised you. The Romans had a proverb used in ordinary speech for generations. For any situation that had become truly desperate, rem ad triarios ridis. It has come down to the triarii. Sit with what that means. An entire culture's expression for the last extremity was the name of the third line of its own battle formation, because if the triarii were fighting, both other lines had already failed, and that almost never happened, which tells you what the triarii actually were. Not primarily a combat unit, a floor. Every hastatus who stepped through the intervals at the end of his strength retired toward a fixed, unbroken hedge of veterans, which means retreat in a Roman army had a defined, survivable shape, and a formation whose men know exactly where falling back ends is a formation whose men will fall back in order instead of running. The sources note something further. That standing hedge discouraged the enemy from pursuing at all. Charging spent men is easy. Charging spent men who are reforming behind a planted line of veteran spears is a different proposition. The triarii won their battles by existing. The most important line in the machine was the one designed never to move, because it was the reason the other two lines could. Step back and look at it whole. The Macedonian phalanx was the perfection of an old idea that a formation is a wall, and a wall is as strong as its cohesion spent in one push. The Triplex Acies was a different idea entirely, that a formation is a machine for managing the one resource every battle actually runs on, human exhaustion, and that geometry, intervals, offsets, staged lines, a fixed reserve can move fresh muscle to the point of contact faster than any wall can spend it. At Pydna, The wall got its perfect day, flat ground, full cohesion, a terrified enemy, and it still ceased to exist in about an hour because the machine absorbed the wall's one push and then took it apart at the seams. The gaps were never holes in the Roman line, they were the reason there was still a Roman line at sundown. And the ideas inside that geometry: units held in echelon, relief before collapse, reserves whose value is that they never commit, never left military thinking. Armies rotate battalions today for the same reason the hastati walked back through the doors. There are more files like this one to open. The Sarissa system deserves its own teardown, and so does the fortress geometry that made cities unbreakable 2,000 years later. If this kind of mechanical history is what you came for, subscribe so the next file reaches you, and if this one changed how you see that checkerboard, the like genuinely helps it find the next person. I will see you in the next one.